The first note of the carol rose thin and uncertain, then steadied as the small congregation found its courage. St. Mildred's Church was cold despite the candles, their flames trembling in the draught that slipped through ancient stone. Snow pressed against the stained glass windows, blurring angels into pale ghosts. It was Christmas Eve, and the village of Barton-under-Witchwood had gathered as it always did, coats buttoned, scarves tucked away, voices lifted more from habit than faith. No one noticed the scream at first. It came not from a throat, but from a sudden sharp intake of breath somewhere behind the third pew, quickly smothered by the swell of once in Royal David City. Only when Mrs. Grafton, the vicar's wife, turned her head and stopped singing did the wrongness ripple outward. The carol faltered, then collapsed into silence as people followed her gaze. Mr. Lionel Evercombe lay slumped against the pew, his head tilted at an awkward angle, hymn book fallen open at his feet. For a heartbeat, there was only confusion, an old man fainting perhaps or overcome by the heat of too many bodies in too small a space. Then Mrs. Grafton saw his eyes. They stared, unblinking, fixed on the carved wooden angel above the altar. A thin, dark line crept from beneath his collar, staining the white of his shirt like spilled ink. The vicar moved first, pushing past knees and handbags, his hand already reaching out in instinctive pastoral concern. He froze when he touched Evercombe's shoulder. It was rigid, cold, even through wool. Someone screamed properly this time. Candles guttered as people surged back. The choirboy dropped his music and burst into tears. By the time the churchwarden locked the doors, more from panic than procedure, the truth had settled like frost. Lionel Evercombe was dead, murdered in the middle of a Christmas carol, surrounded by half the village, and no one had seen a thing. The constable arrived within 20 minutes, his boots leaving wet crescents on the stone floor as he paced the narrow aisle. He was young and earnest, and deeply unhappy to be in charge of something so far beyond the usual lost dogs and drunken arguments. Evercombe's body had been carefully laid flat, his coat unbuttoned. The wound was small, precise, just below the left ear. No knife lay nearby. No blood marked the pews or floor beyond the faint stain at his collar. "It's impossible," Mrs. Grafton kept saying, wringing her hands. "We were all singing. We would have noticed." And that was the problem. The church had been full, over 100 people packed shoulder to shoulder. The doors had been closed against the cold. There was no sign of a struggle, no cry, no sudden movement. If someone had stabbed Evercombe, they had done so invisibly, silently, and vanished into plain sight. As the constable took names, small details began to surface, each one more troubling than the last. Evercombe had arrived late, slipping into the pew just as the first verse began. Mrs. Pelling, who sat beside him, insisted he had been alive and singing softly only moments before the scream. Yet the doctor, summoned from his own interrupted supper, estimated death had occurred at least 10 minutes earlier. Then there was the clue. When the constable checked Evercombe's pockets, he found nothing unusual. Keys, a handkerchief, a small leather wallet, but tucked into the pages of the fallen hymn book was a single sprig of holly, its berries glossy and bright, the stem freshly snapped. It had not been there earlier. Mrs. Pelling was adamant on that point. She disliked holly near her hymn books. It scratched the pages. The holly made no sense. There was plenty of greenery decorating the church, but none within reach of Evercombe's seat. The sprig bore no blood, no fingerprints the constable could see. It might have been a meaningless accident, a festive token dropped by some careless hand. And yet, in a crime where nothing else fit, it stood out with quiet insistence. Outside, the snow continued to fall, softening the village lanes, erasing footprints almost as soon as they formed. Inside St. Mildred's, suspicion began its slow, inevitable spread. Everyone had been present, everyone had sung. And somewhere between the first verse and the second, Lionel Evercombe had been killed in full view of the entire congregation, leaving behind a sprig of holly and a mystery that seemed at first glance quite impossible to solve. The church gradually emptied, not with relief, but with a subdued reluctance, as though leaving might somehow confirm the reality of what had happened. People stepped out into the snow in small murmuring clusters, their faces pale, voices hushed. The constable remained behind with the doctor and the vicar, making notes that already felt inadequate. Lionel Evercombe's body lay covered with a borrowed choir cloak, the sprig of holly carefully placed beside the hymn book on a stone ledge, as if it might wander off if not watched. It was at this moment, when the urgency had dulled into uneasy waiting, that Miss Jane Marple was noticed. She had been sitting near the back all along, wrapped in a sensible coat, her gloved hands folded neatly over her handbag. No one had thought it odd. Miss Marple attended the carol service every year when she came to stay with her nephew in the village. She was small, grey-haired, and entirely unremarkable, the sort of elderly lady the eye slid past without effort. While others whispered and gestured, she had simply watched, her mild blue eyes moving quietly from face to face. "Such a dreadful business," she said now, gently, to no one in particular. The constable turned, startled. "I'm afraid we'll have to ask everyone a few more questions, miss. Just routine." "Of course," Miss Marple replied, with a sympathetic smile. "Routine is so very important. One notices ever so much when things don't follow it." She moved a little closer to the pew where Evercombe had sat, leaning on her umbrella as though for balance. The constable frowned but said nothing. She was hardly interfering, just an old lady peering at the woodwork. Yet her eyes lingered on the narrow space between the pew and the stone wall, on the faint scuff marks near the floor, half hidden by melting snow from people's shoes. "U.S.E., she murmured. "It's rather like village fêtes. Everyone assumes nothing improper can happen because everyone else is watching. That's precisely when it does." The constable cleared his throat. "Did you know the deceased well?" "Only slightly," Miss Marple said. "He had a habit of arriving late and leaving early, a very inconvenient trait in a small community. It makes one curious." Curiosity, it turned out, was not in short supply. As names were checked again, Miss Marple listened from her chair near the vestry door, knitting needles clicking softly. She noticed who spoke too quickly, who volunteered information unasked. Mrs. Pelling repeated her account 3 times, each version identical, down to the phrasing, as though carefully memorized. Mr. Hawes, the choirmaster, insisted on explaining where every boy had stood, his eyes flicking nervously toward the covered body as he spoke. When the doctor stepped aside to wash his hands, Miss Marple approached him. "Such a clever stitch, that wound," she said mildly. "So very neat." The doctor blinked. "Yes, well, a sharp blade, small. It would have taken only a moment." "And yet no one noticed," Miss Marple said. "How extraordinary. People do notice small things, you know. A dropped note, a cracked voice, even a pinprick." She returned to the pew, her gaze settling again on the hymn book. She did not touch it, but she noted how the pages lay open, not to the carol they had been singing, but several pages ahead. Someone, she thought, had turned them in a hurry, or perhaps not in a hurry at all. It was Mrs. Grafton who finally drew attention to herself. She hovered near the altar, twisting her wedding ring, watching the constable with an anxious intensity that bordered on eagerness. "I do hope you'll find who did it quickly," she said. "It would be dreadful to have this hanging over Christmas." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, softly, and Mrs. Grafton jumped, clearly not having noticed her approach. For a fleeting instant something sharp crossed the vicar's wife's face, fear or annoyance, before smoothing itself into polite concern. As the constable prepared to close up the church, Miss Marple bent to retrieve her gloves. Something small and dark lay near the skirting board, almost invisible against the stone. She paused, then straightened, her expression unchanged. "Well," she said pleasantly, "I think I'll go and make a cup of tea. Shocking events are much easier borne with a little warmth." She walked out into the snow with the others, leaving behind a church full of unanswered questions, and a murderer who, for the first time that evening, might have cause to worry that someone had been paying very close attention indeed. Miss Marple's tea grew cold as she listened. The vicarage sitting-room was warm and crowded, its Christmas decorations lending an incongruous cheer to the proceedings. The constable had decided it would be simpler to gather those most closely connected to Lionel Evercombe in one place, rather than tramp through the snow from house to house. Chairs had been drawn into an uneasy semicircle, and the fire crackled loudly as if trying to drown out the tension. Evercombe, it emerged, had been a man with a talent for quietly displeasing people. Mrs. Pelling spoke first, her hands folded primly in her lap. She repeated her story once more, how Mr. Evercombe had slipped into the pew just as the carol began, how he had nodded politely, how she had heard him singing in a low voice beside her. "He seemed quite well," she said. perhaps a little out of breath from the walk, but nothing more. Her gaze flicked to Miss Marple, then away. "I would have noticed if anything were amiss, and yet the doctor believes he was already dead," the constable said gently. Mrs. Pelling's mouth tightened. "Doctors can be mistaken." Mr. Hawes leaned forward eagerly. "I can account for the choir," he said. "Every boy was in his place. No one left the stalls. There was no disturbance at all until the scream." He cleared his throat. "I noticed Mr. Evercombe arrived late, though. He brushed past the end of the pew rather sharply, almost as if he were in a hurry." "In a hurry to sit down?" Miss Marple asked, knitting resting idle in her hands. Mr. Hawes flushed. "Well, perhaps, or perhaps he didn't wish to be noticed." The vicar shifted uncomfortably. "Lionel was a difficult man," he said. "Generous with the church, certainly, but inclined to interfere. He had strong views on how things ought to be done." Mrs. Grafton nodded too quickly. "He was always writing letters, complaints usually, about the heating, the music, the flowers." She smiled thinly. "Some people enjoy being dissatisfied." "Did he write any such letters recently?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Grafton hesitated. "Just for a fraction of a second. Not to my knowledge," she said. "If he had, my husband would have told me." The constable made a note. He then turned to Mr. Daniels, Evercombe's nephew, who had been standing by the window, staring out at the snow as though it held the answer. "I arrived late as well," Daniels said abruptly. "But I didn't see my uncle enter. He didn't speak to me at all this evening." His voice held a faint edge of resentment. "We had differences over money?" the constable asked. Daniels shrugged. He liked control, even over things he no longer owned. Miss Marple watched him carefully. His grief, she thought, was genuine, but so was his relief. One by one they spoke. Each account fitted neatly enough on its own, yet when placed together, the seams showed. Mrs. Pelling insisted Evercombe had been alive moments before his death, but could not recall what verse they had been. End singing. Mr. Hawes was certain no one had moved, yet admitted he had been watching the boys, not the congregation. The vicar spoke of harmony and goodwill, but his fingers worried at his collar as though it chafed. "The holly?" the constable asked at last. "Does anyone know how it came to be in Mr. Evercombe's hymn book?" No one did. Mrs. Grafton said the decorations had been arranged that morning. Mr. Hawes said the choir had not touched them. Mrs. Pelling declared she would never put holly near paper. Miss Marple cleared her throat. "It's a curious thing, Holly," she said mildly. "Very prickly. One notices it when it touches the skin." Mrs. Grafton's hand flew unconsciously to her wrist, then dropped. The movement was so small it might have meant nothing at all. As the questioning drew to a close, the constable looked weary. The answers had multiplied, but clarity had not. Motive hovered everywhere and nowhere, like smoke in the room. Miss Marple gathered her knitting at last. "People often tell the truth," she said, standing. "Just not always the whole of it, and sometimes they tell it too carefully." She smiled at the circle of uneasy faces. Somewhere among them, she knew, was the voice that had faltered just enough to betray its owner. The vicarage gradually emptied, each departure accompanied by forced politeness and an air of palpable relief. Miss Marple remained behind, settling once more into her chair as though she belonged there, which in a way she did. The constable lingered too, grateful for company that did not demand certainty. "It's like pulling at a knotted ball of wool," he said, rubbing his forehead. "If every thread leads somewhere, but none of them lead to the same place." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Wool has a habit of doing that when one tugs at it impatiently. Better to loosen it stitch by stitch." She began with Lionel Evercombe himself. The more she learned, the clearer it became that his quiet presence in the village had masked a talent for influence. He had money, old money, carefully invested, and he liked to remind people of it. Donations to the church came with suggestions. Loans to neighbours came with expectations. Gratitude once earned was never forgotten, and neither were slights. Mr. Daniels' motive lay closest to the surface. Evercombe had recently altered his will, reducing his nephew's inheritance in favour of a charitable trust administered by the church. Fear and resentment made a potent combination, but Daniels' alibi, thin as it was, did not unravel easily. He had arrived after the service began, had stood near the back, and several villagers remembered seeing him there when the carol ended. Mrs. Pelling's connection was more subtle. Evercombe had once owned the cottage she lived in, and though she paid rent faithfully, he had been threatening to sell. Her protestations of indifference rang hollow when Miss Marple learned how attached she was to the place. Yet Mrs. Pelling's frailty worked against her. It was difficult to imagine her delivering such a precise, forceful blow. Mr. Hawes had reason too. Evercombe had complained bitterly about the choir, threatening to withdraw funding unless changes were made. Pride wounded, reputation endangered, strong emotions for a man who lived for his music. But during the service, Hawes had been visibly occupied, conducting with both hands, his attention fixed forward. To strike from the pews without drawing notice would have required remarkable dexterity that left the vicarage itself. Miss Marple asked, gently at first, about the church accounts. The constable, surprised but cooperative, produced his notes. Evercombe had recently demanded a private meeting with the vicar, insisting on transparency. There had been raised voices, overheard by Mrs. Grafton, who dismissed it as nothing more than a disagreement over heating repairs. And yet, Miss Marple murmured, people rarely raise their voices over radiators. Fear began to emerge as a motif. Evercombe had known something he intended to act upon. That explained the holly, perhaps. A marker, a signal, or a distraction placed where it would be noticed only after it was too late. Miss Marple recalled the small, dark object she had glimpsed near the skirting board. With the constable's permission, she returned to the church the following morning. The snow outside lay pristine again, the world reset. Inside, the cold was sharper without the warmth of bodies and song. Near the pew where Evercombe had sat, she found it easily now. A thin, dark pin, no longer than a matchstick, its tip wickedly sharp. It had been dropped, or deliberately placed, where a careful step could nudge it into a pocket or sleeve unnoticed. Such a pin, she thought, could be held between fingers, concealed by a hymn book, and used with deadly precision. The constable frowned. A hat pin? Not quite, Miss Marple said. Too slender. More like a florist's pin. Used for arrangements, holly arrangements. The web tightened. Someone who had handled the decorations would have had access to such pins. Someone accustomed to arranging flowers, perhaps, or someone who had helped, that morning, unnoticed. Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple considered Mrs. Grafton again. The nervous energy, the quick answers, the unconscious touch to her wrist. Fear, not greed, seemed her driving force. Fear of exposure, fear of losing position, respectability, security. Motives are rarely neat, Miss Marple said quietly to the constable. They overlap, but the right one will fit every fact, not just most of them. The maze was narrowing now. Somewhere within it lay a path that led cleanly from holly to pin, from fear, to silence, from a carol's steady rhythm to a single fatal moment hidden in song. By mid-morning the village hummed with a brittle sort of optimism, the kind that springs up when uncertainty appears, at last, to have a shape. The constable arrived at the vicarage with a set jaw and a notebook full of purpose, his boots stamping snow from the threshold as though to announce progress. They had found the pin. It lay wrapped carefully in a handkerchief, retrieved not from the church this time, but from the pocket of Mr. Daniel's overcoat discovered during a routine search he had submitted to with a tight, defiant smile. The pin matched exactly the one Miss Marple had seen near the pew. Same length, same darkened metal, its point still faintly stained. The constable spoke with the relief of a man grateful for something solid at last. He says he helped decorate a church that morning, the constable explained. Handled the holly himself. Must have slipped it into his pocket by mistake. Must have, Miss Marple echoed mildly. Daniel's explanation grew more tangled with each retelling. He had arrived late, yes, but only because of the snow. He had stood near the back, yes, but had moved forward briefly to find a better view of the choir. Someone must have brushed against him. Someone must have planted the pin. His voice rose, then cracked, as though outrage had exhausted itself into fear. The constable listened, but his mind was made up. Opportunity, motive, and now the means, all neatly aligned. The pin, once an abstraction, had become a convenient keystone. By afternoon, Daniels was escorted away, his protests trailing behind him like torn ribbon. The village exhaled. Miss Marple watched it happen with a small, troubled frown. People smiled again in the post office. The butcher shook his head solemnly and said he had always thought there was something cold about the nef. Ew. Mrs. Pelling wept with relief. Even Mrs. Grafton's shoulders seemed to ease, her manner lighter as she poured tea that afternoon. "And yet," Miss Marple said quietly, as Mrs. Grafton passed her a cup, "relief can be misleading." Mrs. Grafton's smile faltered. "I don't see why. It's over now, isn't it? Poor Lionel, at least we know who did it, do we?" Miss Marple wondered, but she did not say it aloud. That evening she returned once more to St. Mildred's, ostensibly to collect a scarf she claimed to have left behind. The constable, satisfied with his work, gave permission readily enough. The church was dim, shadows pooling between pews. Miss Marple moved slowly, reconstructing the service in her mind, the swell of voices, the moment when all eyes were lifted to the altar, the safety of being unseen. She stood where Daniels had stood, then where Mrs. Grafton had stood. She imagined the pin in a gloved hand, the hymn book lifted just so. She imagined fear, not hot and reckless, but cold and calculating, sharpened by the knowledge that exposure would ruin everything. The pin in Daniel's pocket troubled her deeply. It was too convenient. People who commit murder rarely keep the weapon about them like a calling card, unless they wish to be found, or wish someone else to be. And then there was the holly, freshly snapped, purposefully placed, not dropped in panic but tucked neatly between pages. A gesture almost, a signal to be read later. Miss Marple bent near the pew again and noticed what she had missed before. A faint smear on the wood, no longer than a thumbprint, darker than the grain. Resin, perhaps, or sap, holly sap. She straightened slowly. Somewhere beyond the church door, bells began to ring for evening prayer, their sound hollow and reassuring. Too reassuring. Miss Marple felt the prickle of unease settle firmly in her chest. The village believed the murderer had been caught. The authorities were satisfied. Christmas, it seemed, had been salvaged. But Miss Marple knew better. The tune, like the carol itself, was familiar, but something in it was still slightly off-key, and until that note was resolved, the real danger remained, quiet and patient, waiting for the moment when everyone else had stopped listening. Sleep eluded Miss Marple that night. The village lay hushed beneath its quilt of snow, yet her mind refused the comfort of stillness. Again and again, the same images returned, the holly tucked so deliberately into the hymn book, the neatness of the wound, the unmistakable look of fear that had crossed Mrs. Grafton's face when no one thought to notice. These were not the gestures of a crime born in a single moment. They were echoes. By morning she had found her way to the small parish study adjoining the vicarage, where decades of church records were kept in neat, leather-bound rows. The vicar, relieved to be asked about something practical rather than tragic, left her alone with a pot of tea and the key. Miss Marple worked slowly, methodically, her fingers tracing names and dates with the same care she brought to her knitting. It was Lionel Evercomb's name that appeared again and again, not only in recent donation ledgers but in older minutes, written in a firmer, darker hand. 10 years ago, there had been another disturbance in Barton under Wetchwood. No murder then, but a scandal quietly hushed. A young woman had left the village abruptly, her reputation in tatters, her position at the church terminated without explanation. The matter had been discussed briefly, then closed. The name caught Miss Marple's breath. Margaret Ellis. She turned the page and found the connection at last. Margaret Ellis had been the vicar's secretary before Mrs. Grafton arrived in the village as his bride. Evercombe, it seemed, had been instrumental in her dismissal. He had raised concerns about impropriety, about funds mismanaged and documents altered. No proof had ever been produced, but Evercombe's word had carried weight. Margaret Ellis had gone away in disgrace and, according to a terse margin note, died 2 years later. Miss Marple closed the ledger softly. Some injustices, she reflected, did not fade. They fermented. Later that morning she paid a visit to Mrs. Pelling under the harmless pretext of borrowing a recipe. The small cottage smelled faintly of polish and damp wool. On the mantel stood a framed photograph of a younger woman, her smile cautious but warm. "My sister," Mrs. Pelling said, following Miss Marple's gaze. "Margaret." Miss Marple nodded gently. "She worked at the church once, didn't she?" Mrs. Pelling's hands trembled as she set down the teacups, briefly. Before everything went wrong, before Lionel Evercombe spoke against her, Miss Marple said quietly. The silence that followed was heavy with things long suppressed. Mrs. Pelling sank into her chair as though her strength had deserted her. "He ruined her," she whispered, "and when I begged him to reconsider, when I showed him the letters that proved she was innocent, he laughed. Said mistakes had consequences. Fear," Miss Marple thought again, "and resentment, carefully tended over years." By the time she returned to the vicarage, the pattern was unmistakable. Mrs. Grafton had not been a bystander in that earlier affair. As Evercomb's confidant and later his financial ally, she had known precisely how fragile her position was. If Evercombe had begun to speak again, begun to reopen old accounts, then everything she had built, her respectability, her authority, would have been at risk. And Mrs. Pelling, so frail and overlooked, had been close enough to the pew to place the holly, to pass the pin, to ensure the message was delivered without ever striking the blow herself. The past had not merely resurfaced, it had reached forward, guiding hands and silences alike. Miss Marple folded her gloves with care. "People believe time buries things," she murmured to herself, "but it only hides them. And sometimes, when the ground is disturbed, they rise again." Outside, the bells began to ring once more, their sound drifting across the village like a promise. Somewhere, she knew, the final thread waited to be pulled, one that would unravel not only the crime of Christmas Eve, but the quiet, festering wrong that had made it inevitable. Miss Marple understood that direct accusation would accomplish nothing. Those who had lived for years behind careful masks rarely dropped them when confronted head-on. What was needed was something gentler, almost trivial, an ordinary moment made just sharp enough to reveal the truth beneath it. She began with the flowers. On Christmas morning, the vicarage buzzed with restrained festivity. Despite everything, tradition insisted on asserting itself, and Mrs. Grafton had arranged a small gathering after morning prayers. The table in the sitting room held a modest spread, and at its centre stood a fresh arrangement of holly, ivy, and white roses. Miss Marple admired it openly. "How beautifully done," she said. "Such a steady hand. Floristry requires patience, doesn't it? Pins in just the right places, hidden so the greenery appears effortless." Mrs. Grafton smiled, a little too proudly. "I've always enjoyed it. One must learn to be careful with holly. It scratches terribly if you're not paying attention." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "And the sap stains. Most inconvenient." Mrs. Grafton's smile flickered, but she said nothing. Miss Marple turned her attention to Mrs. Pelling, who stood nearby, hands folded as always. "Your sister used to arrange flowers too, didn't she?" Miss Marple asked pleasantly. Mrs. Pelling stiffened. "Margaret did many things." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "She had quite a talent. Lionel Evercombe mentioned it once, you know. He said she had an eye for detail." She paused, letting the words settle. "He also said he intended to correct a mistake he'd made." The room seemed to tilt. Mrs. Pelling's breath caught audibly. Mrs. Grafton set down her teacup with a sharp click. "Correct what mistake?" Mrs. Grafton demanded. "Why, the dismissal," Miss Marple said calmly. "He planned to make a public apology, restore her good name. He even intended to speak of it at the carol service when everyone was present." The lie was delivered softly, wrapped in plausibility. Miss Marple watched their faces with the care of a naturalist observing rare birds. Mrs. Pelling sagged into a chair, tears springing to her eyes. Not of relief, but of despair. "He said he might," she whispered, "but he never promised." Mrs. Grafton, on the other hand, had gone very still. Colour drained from her face, leaving it pinched and pale. "That's absurd," she said too quickly. "He would have told my husband." "Would he?" Miss Marple asked. "After all, it was your advice he followed the first time. The silence that followed was absolute." Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked loudly. Miss Marple pressed on, gently but relentlessly. "You see, I wondered why the holly was placed so neatly in the hymn book. Not dropped, not crushed. A message meant to be found. For someone who would recognize its meaning." Mrs. Grafton's composure cracked. "You're imagining things." "Am I?" Miss Marple said. "Margaret Ellis used to mark her arrangements with holly, didn't she? A little habit. Mrs. Pelling would know." Mrs. Pelling nodded faintly, tears spilling over at last. "It was her signature. And the pin," Miss Marple continued, "passed at just the right moment. A haired act. One to place the sign, one to make sure the means was ready." Mrs. Grafton's control finally gave way. "I couldn't let him ruin us," she said, the words tumbling out. "He was going to reopen everything. He enjoyed the power of it. I only meant to frighten him, make him keep silent. But when the moment came, she covered her face with her hands. The test had worked. Not through force, but through truth presented sideways, impossible to ignore. Miss Marple stood quietly as the weight of it settled. Outside, the sound of carolers drifted faintly through the frosted windows, sweet and unaware. The deception had cracked at last. Not with a shout, but with a whisper, and in that whisper lay the proof Miss Marple had been seeking all along. The room seemed to breathe again only after Mrs. Grafton's words had fallen into the silence and settled there, heavy and irrevocable. Miss Marple did not move at once. She had learned long ago that confession, once coaxed into the open, was a fragile thing, easily withdrawn, reshaped, denied if not handled with care. "We must speak to the constable," she said gently at last. Mrs. Grafton nodded, her face drained of resistance. But it was Mrs. Pelling who startled them both. She rose abruptly, wiping her eyes with the corner of her shawl. "No," she said hoarsely. "Not yet. Not until we know what's been done." Miss Marple looked at her keenly. "What do you mean?" Before Mrs. Pelling could answer, the front door opened and closed with unusual force. The vicar's voice sounded in the hall, strained, confused. A moment later he appeared, his expression tight with something close to panic. "The church," he said. "Something's wrong." They followed him out into the cold, the morning brightness suddenly harsh. St. Mildred's stood exactly as it always had, but inside, the stillness felt violated. The constable was already there, crouched near. "Are the pew where Lionel Evercombe had died?" "The hymn book," he said grimly. "It's gone." Miss Marple felt a small chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The book had been logged, set aside, its significance not yet fully appreciated by anyone but herself. Now the ledge where it had rested was bare, save for a faint dust mark where it had lain. "And the holly?" she asked. "Gone too?" The implication was unmistakable. Someone had acted swiftly and deliberately. The confession, fragile as it was, had not yet been secured. Without the physical evidence to support it, doubt could still creep in, slow and corrosive. Mrs. Grafton swayed, catching herself on the back of a pew. "I didn't take it," she whispered. "I swear it." Miss Marple believed her. This had the feel of desperation layered upon desperation, not the cold calculation Mrs. Grafton had displayed before. The constable straightened, his earlier confidence shaken. "Only a few people knew where it was kept," he said. "You, me, and the vicar." The vicar stared at him, appalled. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm suggesting," the constable said carefully, "that someone wants this buried. Permanently. Trust already thin, frayed further." The vicar insisted he had been in the study all morning. Mrs. Pelling said nothing at all, her gaze fixed on the empty ledge. Miss Marple watched them all, her mind racing not backward but forward. If the evidence had been removed, it was not to escape justice alone. It was to reshape the story before it could be fully told. "They don't need the hymn book," Miss Marple said suddenly. "Not any more." The constable frowned. "What do you mean?" "The holly was a message," she said, "but messages are only useful once. After that they're dangerous." As if summoned by the thought, a sound echoed from the far end of the church, a sharp crack, like wood splitting. They hurried toward it, and found the small side door ajar, cold air rushing in. Outside, the snow was churned and uneven, footprints leading away toward the lane. Near the threshold lay a torn page, crumpled and half-soaked, its ink running. Miss Marple picked it up carefully. Only a few words were still legible, blurred but unmistakable. "Correct the mistake." Public acknowledgement. Mrs. Grafton let out a low sound, somewhere between a sob and a gasp. He wrote it down. "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "And someone found it?" The constable closed his eyes briefly. The case, which had seemed so near resolution, had slipped sideways again. Evidence destroyed, confession unrecorded, alliances uncertain. Somewhere in the village, someone was moving pieces still, trying to force the story back into a safer shape. Miss Marple folded the damp scrap of paper with care. "We're very close now," she said. "Close enough to frighten someone who thought they were finished." Outside, the bells began to ring once more, bright and insistent, but beneath their cheerful peal ran an undercurrent of urgency. Time, like trust, was thinning, and whoever had stolen the truth intended to make sure it vanished completely unless stopped. The bells had barely finished their peal when the scream cut through it, sharp and unmistakably human. It came from the lane behind the church, a sound so full of terror that it scattered the constable's thoughts like birds from a hedge. He was already running by the time Miss Marple turned, her heart giving a painful lurch. They found Mrs. Pelling lying half in the snow, half against the low stone wall that bordered the churchyard. Her shawl had slipped from her shoulders, and one gloved hand clawed weakly at the ground. Blood darkened the white beneath her, blooming outward with cruel clarity. She was alive. The constable knelt beside her, shouting for help, his voice echoing oddly in the open air. Miss Marple lowered herself carefully, ignoring the cold that bit through her coat, and took Mrs. Pelling's hand. "Who did this?" the constable demanded, his urgency barely restrained. Mrs. Pelling's lips moved soundlessly at first, then her eyes fluttered open, finding Miss Marple's face with desperate focus. "She came back," she whispered. "I told her it was over." "Who?" Miss Marple asked softly, leaning closer. Mrs. Pelling swallowed with effort. "Not Eleanor," she breathed. "The other one." The words fell like a stone into water. Miss Marple felt the ripple immediately. Margaret Ellis. An ambulance was summoned, but even as they waited, Miss Marple knew the truth had twisted again. Margaret Ellis was supposed to be dead, buried years ago with her disgrace. And yet here was her name, dragged bleeding into the present. Mrs. Pelling's grip tightened suddenly. She took it, she whispered. The book, the letter. She said she wouldn't let it happen again. The word throbbed with meaning. By the time the ambulance arrived, Mrs. Pelling had lost consciousness. The constable stood back, snow clinging to his trousers, his face grim. "If she's right," he said slowly, "we're dealing with someone who's been hiding in plain sight, or someone who shouldn't exist at all." Miss Marple's mind moved swiftly now, arranging pieces with ruthless clarity. Margaret Ellis had left the village in disgrace, but no one had seen her die. Only a notice, only a convenient ending. If she had returned, changed, hardened, then this was no longer a single act of desperation, but a campaign. They did not have long to wait for proof. That evening, as dusk settled and the village gathered itself in shaken silence, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage to collect her things. The house was unusually quiet, too quiet. She paused in the hall, a familiar unease creeping along her spine. The study door stood ajar. Inside, papers were scattered across the desk, drawers pulled open with none of the clumsy haste of a burglar. This was a search conducted by someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. Miss Marple stepped forward and froze. A shadow shifted near the window. "Please don't scream," a woman's voice said calmly. "I really don't wish to hurt you." Miss Marple's heart beat steadily, though she felt its force all the same. The woman stepped into the lamplight. She was older than the photograph on Mrs. Pelling's mantel, but unmistakable. The same cautious smile, sharpened now into something resolute. "Margaret Ellis," Miss Marple said quietly. Margaret inclined her head. "I hoped you would understand." "Understanding and approval are not the same thing," Miss Marple replied. Margaret's eyes flickered. "They ruined my life. Lionel Evercombe destroyed me because it amused him. Eleanor only finished what he began." "And Mrs. Pelling?" Miss Marple asked. "Was she part of your justice too?" Margaret's composure faltered for the first time. She tried to stop me. Miss Marple saw then how far the line had been crossed. This was no longer about redressing a wrong. It was about erasing witnesses, reshaping history by force. "You won't get away with this," Miss Marple said gently. Margaret smiled, thin and sad. "I already have. For years." A sound in the hall, a step hurried and uncertain, made Margaret's head snap up. In that instant, Miss Marple understood the danger fully. The past had not only returned, it was still moving, still striking, and unless stopped now, it would claim another victim before the night was through. The hurried step in the hall retreated as suddenly as it had come, followed by the soft click of a door closing somewhere deeper in the house. Margaret Ellis turned her head to listen, her expression tightening with calculation. For a moment, Miss Marple thought she might bolt, but Margaret did not move. Instead, she looked back with a faint, almost weary smile. "You see," she said, "they always arrive just a little too late." "Not always," Miss Marple replied. Her voice was calm, but her mind was racing, not with fear now, but with clarity. Something had shifted, Like the final piece of a puzzle sliding into place, Margaret had been careful, too careful. She had destroyed evidence, silenced a witness, moved through the village like a shadow. And yet she had left traces, not physical ones this time, but habits. Patterns. "You've changed your name," Miss Marple said conversationally, as if remarking on the weather. "But you didn't change everything, did you?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple gestured toward the desk, where a stack of papers lay neatly aligned despite the disturbance. "You straighten things as you go. Margaret Ellis did the same. Mrs. Pelling told me once she never could leave a surface untidy, even in distress." Margaret's mouth tightened, but she said nothing. "And the holly," Miss Marple continued. "You didn't just choose it because of its meaning. You chose it because it was familiar. Because you had worked with it before year after year. It was instinct." Margaret laughed softly. "Instinct doesn't make one a murderer." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but it reveals one." She moved slowly toward the desk, picking up a small notebook Margaret had overlooked in her haste. Inside were neat lists, times, names, small reminders written in a careful hand. Miss Marple did not need to read them closely. The order itself was enough. "Every significant moment in this affair happened during communal distraction," she said. "The carol service, the bells, the bustle after prayers. You rely on noise to cover silence, on crowds to hide solitary acts." Margaret's gaze flicked involuntarily toward the window, where the church bells could just be seen in the distance. "And then there's your timing," Miss Marple went on. "You struck Mrs. Pelling when the village believed the danger had passed, when vigilance had relaxed. It's the same pattern as before, 10 years ago. A scandal raised just as attention was focused elsewhere. You didn't only want justice, you wanted control." The word hung between them. Margaret's composure wavered, just slightly. "They took everything from me." "They took your future," Miss Marple said gently. "But you have been taking other people's present ever since." Footsteps sounded again in the hall, firmer this time. The constable's voice called out, cautious but close. Margaret's shoulders sagged, the fight draining from her at last. "I never meant for Eleanor to die," she said quietly. "That was her fear, her weakness. I only meant to stop Lionel, to stop him speaking." "And when he did?" Miss Marple asked. Margaret looked away. "I finished it." The pattern was complete now. 2 women bound by the same injustice, each reacting differently, one with fear, one with vengeance, one strike meant to silence, another to erase. The holly, the pin, the hymn book, the stolen letter, all instruments in a design shaped long before Christmas Eve. The constable appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with swift comprehension. Margaret did not resist as he stepped forward. She merely nodded, as though acknowledging an outcome she had known was inevitable. As she was led away, Miss Marple followed slowly, her gaze drifting once more to the church beyond the frost-laced glass. How many times, she wondered, had the answer stood plainly before them all? In habits mistaken for harmless quirks, in traditions repeated year after year, in the quiet belief that the past, once buried, stayed buried. Outside the bells rang again, but now Miss Marple heard something different in their peal, not celebration but resolution. The village would speak of the murder for years, she knew, but eventually it would soften into story, then memory. Miss Marple drew her coat more tightly around her shoulders and stepped into the cold. The key had been there all along, hidden not in shadows but in plain sight, waiting for someone willing to look not at what was loud and dramatic, but at what was steady, familiar, and quietly repeating itself. And that, she reflected, was where the truth so often lived. The evening air was sharp as Miss Marple walked slowly along the lane that led back toward the church. The snow underfoot crunched softly, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and holly. The village had returned to a brittle quiet, but Miss Marple knew the disturbance was not over, not in the minds of those who had lived through it. She felt it in the air, a tautness left behind by fear and secrecy. Back at the vicarage, over a modest tea now shared with the constable, Miss Marple began to untangle the last threads. The arrests had been made, the immediate danger contained, but something still unsettled her. Margaret Ellis had confessed, yes, but the reason for her single-minded determination remained elusive. Resentment could explain her return, her careful planning, even the violence, but not fully. People who had lost everything often sought restitution, yet few orchestrated murder to achieve it. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Mrs. Pelling's trembling confession and the ledger she had examined. What had Evercombe done that was so potent it reached forward even from the grave to push Margaret into extreme acts? She considered the careful arrangement of the holly, the pin, the stolen letter, all symbols deliberate and personal. There was a psychology behind it, one that hinted at more than mere revenge. The breakthrough came quietly, unremarkably, in the vicarage sitting room. Miss Marple noticed a photograph on the mantelpiece, slightly askew, taken decades ago at a village fete. She had seen it before, glanced past it even, but now something caught her eye. In the back of the crowd stood a young Margaret Ellis, her eyes fixed not on the camera but on a man to the side, Lionel Evercombe. There was a peculiar intensity in her gaze, an almost obsessive focus, so different from the casual interest of the other childer. Miss Marple leaned closer. It was the look of someone who had once felt invisible and overlooked, someone who had been humiliated publicly yet never forgotten the sting. The realization came then, clear and cold. This was never just about Evercombe's influence, his money, or his meddling in church affairs. This was about the deepest human need, to reclaim identity, to assert existence when one has been erased. Margaret Ellis had returned not merely to correct a perceived wrong, but to rewrite her own narrative. Each action, the timing of the attack on Mrs. Pelling, the theft of the hymn book, the meticulous placement of the holly, was a statement. It was her voice, speaking from the shadows, forcing recognition of the life that had been denied to her. That long-buried anger had transformed into an almost clinical orchestration of events, using fear as a tool and the village's assumptions as cover. The constable, pouring tea nearby, noticed her sudden stillness. "What is it, Miss Marple?" "I've realized why she did it," Miss Marple said, folding her hands over the cup. It was not only revenge, it was affirmation. Every detail, every act was meant to assert her existence, to force the world to acknowledge her presence after decades of erasure. She had been invisible once, and she could not endure that again. The constable frowned. "Invisible? You mean she wanted to be recognized?" "Precisely," Miss Marple said. The crime was a mirror, reflecting the life she was denied. Every move, every careful planning of evidence was not only to punish Evercombe, but to reclaim herself. She was meticulous because she feared losing control again, and she was ruthless because the stakes to her were existential. Miss Marple rose, her gaze drifting toward the window and the distant spire of St. Mildred's. "It is shocking, yes, but in a way it is also understandable. When someone has been dismissed, humiliated and forgotten, the need to assert one's identity can be stronger than any moral restraint." The constable shook his head slowly, almost in awe. So all the cleverness, all the deception, it wasn't just about the letter or the money or the position. It was about her, herself. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "and that is why she risked everything. Not to gain anything in the usual sense, but to restore a sense of self the world had stolen. The rest, the timing, the holly, the pin, the letters, was the language she had chosen to speak with. Outside, snow drifted silently across the lanes, covering the village in its quiet blanket. But now the silence carried a different weight, a knowledge of a human heart so deeply wounded that it could orchestrate murder in the name of recognition. Miss Marple sipped her tea, thinking how often crime was not merely a matter of gain or loss, but of existence, pride, and the desperate desire to be seen. And sometimes, she reflected, the truth of that human need was far more shocking than any act it inspired. Miss Marple had spent the morning arranging her thoughts with the precision of a gardener pruning a carefully tended hedge. Every move Margaret Ellis had made, every step she had taken, was now mapped in her mind like a carefully laid path. She had waited until the village was settled, the constable briefed, and the witnesses accounted for. The trap needed no elaborate machinery, only understanding, patience, and the careful exposure of a truth that could not be ignored. She chose the vicarage drawing-room for the confrontation. It was bright with midday sun streaming through frost-lined windows, and the faint scent of pine from a nearby wreath lingered in the air. Margaret Ellis was invited under the pretense of discussing her surrender formally, yet Miss Marple knew it would not require pretense. She had a single advantage: time. Time to let Margaret feel the pattern of her own actions closing around her. When Margaret arrived, she carried her usual quiet composure. But the eyes that met Miss Marple's were sharper now, restless, scanning, calculating. The constable stood near the fireplace, ready but silent, trusting the older woman to set the tone. "My dear," Miss Marple began softly, "I've had a most enlightening morning. I have gone over every detail of the past days, and even of the events long before they returned to haunt us." She paused, letting the words settle. "You are clever, Miss Ellis, clever and careful, but cleverness cannot erase a lifetime of habits. Nor can it disguise the truth from those who watch closely." Margaret's lips twitched, as if to respond, then she restrained herself. "I see now why it mattered so much," Miss Marple continued. "The carol service, the stolen hymn book, the carefully placed holly, these were not only actions but statements, statements about who you were and who the world had tried to make you. You wished to be seen, acknowledged, even if it required terrifying those around you." Margaret's composure cracked slightly. Her hands, previously folded, twitched as though on the verge of motion. "You think you understand," she said softly, almost a whisper. "But you don't know what it is to be invisible, to be erased, to have every life that should have welcomed you turn its back instead." "I understand enough," Miss Marple said firmly, "and I understand that you are afraid of being forgotten again. But terror is not the way to reclaim yourself. You see, fear changes nothing permanently. Only recognition, truth, and reconciliation do that." Margaret's eyes darted to the window, toward the churchyard where snow glimmered coldly in the sunlight. "And if no one listens?" she murmured. "If the world only judges you by what it is, ease in a moment, not the life it ignored for decades?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle but unwavering. "Then one must let the truth speak for itself. Which is why you must answer for what has happened. You must allow the world to see the whole of your actions, not just the carefully orchestrated fragments." Margaret drew in a breath, her resolve faltering under the patient pressure. Her fingers twitched toward her coat pocket, the place where she had kept a small, sharp pin, the instrument that had begun the chain of violence. The constable's hand moved subtly toward her, but Miss Marple's eyes held Margaret steady and unyielding. "There is no need for another act," she said softly. "The trap has already closed without a single harsh word being necessary." Margaret's shoulders sagged, and the hand that had sought the pin relaxed, curling loosely at her side. Her voice shook, but the sound was quiet and unequivocal. It was never meant to end this way. I only wanted recognition." "You have it now," Miss Marple said. "Not the recognition that destroys, but the one that allows truth to emerge." For a moment Margaret stared at her, the tension in her body slowly dissipating. She looked toward the constable and then at Miss Marple again. Finally she nodded, almost imperceptibly, and allowed herself to be guided toward surrender. The sun shifted through the frost-lined windows, catching the edge of the wreath and casting patterns across the carpet. Outside, the village bells rang again, steady and sure. Inside, a calm settled over the room, one born not of resolution alone, but of understanding. Miss Marple remained composed as she always did, knowing that every careful observation, every subtle question, and every patient step had brought the truth fully to light. Margaret Ellis, once hidden in the shadows of her own history, would face justice, yet the pattern T had defined her actions. The need to be seen, acknowledged, and understood had finally been recognized, and with that recognition, the final act of the long, tangled drama of Barton under Witchwood was finally concluded. The snow had begun to fall again, soft and insistent, covering the village in a fresh layer of white as if to suggest that the events of the past week could be buried and forgotten. Miss Marple watched from the vicarage window while the constable walked Margaret Ellis to the waiting police carriage. There was a sense of closure in the air, a fragile peace. Yet deep in her mind Miss Marple felt the faintest stirrings of unease. Something she suspected remained unresolved. She returned to the drawing-room, the warmth of the fire brushing against her chilled hands. The vicar had insisted on tea, perhaps in a bid to normalize what had been anything but ordinary. The villagers had not yet returned from their errands, and silence filled the house in a way that was almost too complete. Miss Marple moved to the mantelpiece, absently straightening a photograph, when her gaze fell on a familiar figure in the frame, Lionel Evercombe smiling at some forgotten village fate. She remembered the photograph clearly from days before, Yet now a subtle detail caught her eye, one she had overlooked, a second, smaller figure behind Evercombe, partially obscured, almost imperceptible, and yet unmistakably the same sharp measuring gaze that had characterized Margaret Ellis. Miss Marple leaned closer, inspecting the photo with the careful attention she had once given to a clue in a ledger. Then it struck her. The photograph had been slightly altered, not maliciously, not obviously, but enough that one could easily miss the second figure's prominence. Someone had staged it. Someone had made it seem as though Margaret had acted alone. The vicar noticed her furrowed brow. "Miss Marple?" he asked gently. She straightened, lifting the photograph. "Do you know when this was last handled?" The vicar hesitated. I haven't touched it since the service began." "Exactly," Miss Marple murmured, setting the frame down carefully. And yet someone who wished to mislead would ensure that attention focused entirely on Margaret. Convenient, wouldn't you agree? A soft noise from the hallway made her turn. The door opened slightly, and the constable stepped in, shaking snow from his coat. "Miss Marple, I thought I locked the study, but—" He froze mid-step, noticing her expression. "Constable," she said quietly, "I believe there is another player in this tale. One we have not considered carefully enough. Another." "You mean someone behind all of this?" he asked, unease creeping into his tone. Miss Marple nodded. "Observe the timing of events, the pin, the stolen hymn book, the precise moments chosen to strike. Margaret executed the acts perfectly, yes, but only after information reached her at just the right moments. Someone fed her knowledge, someone close enough to watch every move yet distant enough to remain unseen." The constable frowned. "Who?" Before Miss Marple could answer, a light knock sounded at the door. The vicar opened it to reveal a visitor she had scarcely expected, Mrs. Grafton, appearing oddly composed despite everything that had occurred. Her hands were clasped tightly, and her eyes avoided Miss Marple's gaze at first, settling instead on the constable. Mrs. Grafton began, her voice careful. "I thought I should tell you." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Tell me what?" Mrs. Grafton took a hesitant step inside, her composure fracturing in the presence of the evidence and observation she could no longer manipulate. "It wasn't Margaret alone," she admitted, each word deliberate. "I guided her. Every hesitation, every hidden moment. She trusted me. I made sure the letters were in the right place, that the pin was discovered, that the holly, everything pointed to her, not me. The room seemed to freeze. Even the constable looked stunned. Mrs. Grafton," Miss Marple said softly, "you were the unseen hand." "Yes," Mrs. Grafton whispered. "I had everything to lose. Lionel's influence, my position, my life here. Margaret acted in her own vengeance, yes, but I orchestrated the timing, ensured the evidence led where it would, and—" She swallowed, her voice dropping. "And I knew Margaret would take the fall if I guided her well enough." Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and steady, studied her for a long moment. And the fear that drove Margaret, the meticulous execution, the stolen hymn book, that was your pattern behind her actions? Mrs. Grafton nodded slowly, the mask of civility finally slipping. "I wanted to stop Lionel from speaking again. I wanted the past to stay buried. But I never intended to kill anyone myself. I only wanted to manipulate events so that the danger was diverted." Miss Marple let the words settle. The final twist, the revelation of the true mastermind, reshaped everything. Margaret Ellis had been both avenger and instrument, but Mrs. Grafton had been the silent conductor, guiding each note in a symphony of fear and precision. Outside, the snow continued to fall quietly, masking the evidence of footsteps and chaos. Inside, the room hummed with tension. The truth had emerged, yet it was far more intricate and unsettling than anyone had anticipated. The detective's mind raced, piecing together the consequences, knowing that justice must now account for both the hand that struck and the hand that had guided it from the shadows. Miss Marple's calm face betrayed nothing of the storm inside her mind, yet she already saw the path forward, the unravelling of the final layer, the revelation that the most unexpected player had been orchestrating the game from behind the scenes all along. The snow had slowed to a gentle drift, softening the edges of the village but not the sharp lines of the events that had unfolded. The vicarage, still warm from the fire, felt impossibly quiet after the confessions, the confrontations, and the revelations. Miss Marple sat in her accustomed chair, tea long gone cold beside her, watching Mrs. Grafton and the constable through a lens of calm observation. Everything had changed with the disclosure that the seemingly innocent vicar's wife had been the unseen hand guiding Margaret Ellis. Yet Miss Marple, as always, had already considered the ramifications long before they had spoken aloud. Mrs. Grafton had been taken into custody quietly, her protestations muted by the weight of her complicity. Margaret Ellis, now in protective custody, had revealed enough to clarify the events, but not enough to destroy herself entirely. The two women were bound by circumstance, vengeance, and manipulation, each a mirror of the OT. Hers fears and desires. Outside, the village held its breath, the faint scent of burning holly and pine drifting through the frosted streets, while inside, Miss Marple began to untangle what had truly passed unnoticed. "Do you see it, Constable?" she said softly, not looking up from the meticulous notes she had made. It was never merely Margaret acting on her own. Mrs. Grafton's hand was invisible, yes, but traceable if one observed the patterns she could not disguise. The constable, still wary from the recent revelations, nodded slowly. "You mean the clues that everyone overlooked, the way Margaret knew things before anyone else did?" "Precisely," Miss Marple replied. "Look at the holly." At first glance, an innocuous gesture, a nod to tradition, but placed with care, it marked not only Margaret's involvement, but also indicated that someone had prepared the timing. The pin, the letters, the so-called theft of the hymn book, each a signal to manipulate perception, to direct suspicion, to control the narrative. Margaret's psychology was the engine, but Mrs. Grafton's orchestration was the steering wheel. The constable frowned. "And the photograph? The one with her in the background?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. A subtle yet crucial indication. Someone had arranged that image so that Margaret's presence in the crowd would be noticed by the right eyes and overlooked by the wrong ones. That was not accidental. It was a breadcrumb, unnoticed because we assume photographs are static, truthful. But here, it was an instrument of deception and confirmation. She paused, thinking of the final confrontation. How easily a single overlooked habit, the straightening of papers, the precise placement of objects, even the instinctive handling of the holly, had revealed the orchestration behind the apparent chaos. In the end, it had been patience, observation, and careful interpretatio, of human behaviour, that had brought the truth to light. Yet, as she watched the snow swirl past the window, Miss Marple felt a subtle unease she could not entirely dismiss. Mrs. Grafton's pride, her intelligence, and her capacity for control meant that even behind bars she might manipulate or inspire others in ways unseen. Margaret Ellis, for all her youth and fury, had not acted entirely independently either. The village had glimpsed the consequences of human obsession and desire, and the knowledge that such patterns could recur lingered in the air, like the scent of pine smoke in winter. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. Justice had been delivered, but not in a manner that erased the moral complexity of what had occurred. The holly remained on the table, the same arrangement that had marked the beginning of the chain of events, a reminder that symbols, habits, and choices could wield power beyond the comprehension of those who simply looked at surfaces. "People often miss what is under their very noses," she murmured, "not because it is hidden, but because it is familiar. They see what they expect to see, not what is truly there." The constable looked at her, admiration mixed with exasperation. "And that is why you are always one step ahead." Miss Marple inclined her head, allowing a faint smile. "Observation, patience, and understanding the human heart. That is always the key. The rest, the evidence, the timing, the cleverness of a criminal mind, these are only puzzles waiting for someone willing to see the pattern." Outside, the village settled under a blanket of snow, lights glimmering in windows as if nothing had happened. And yet, in the quiet hush of Barton under Wychwood, Miss Marple knew that the past, the habits, and the obsessions of human hearts would never be truly silent. Justice had been served, yes, but the lesson remained. The smallest details, the tiniest gestures, could shift the balance between truth and deception, between what is visible and what is carefully concealed. And in that truth, she found both satisfaction and an enduring vigilance that would never rest. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the snow-dusted hills, casting long shadows across Barton under Witchwood. Miss Marple stepped carefully along the frosted lane, her coat drawn tightly around her, the crisp winter air brushing against her cheeks. The village had returned, outwardly at least, to its quiet rhythms. Windows glimmered with candlelight, the distant chiming of the church bells still echoing faintly through the chill. Justice had been delivered, yet a subtle unease lingered in her mind, a whisper of a question that refused to be dismissed. She paused at the edge of the village green, watching children trudge through the snow, their laughter light and careless. Even as she enjoyed the familiar scene, her sharp eyes caught a small anomaly, a single wreath, half hidden under the low eaves of the old village shop, its ribbon slightly torn, and its evergreen spray flattened as though something, or someone, had disturbed it recently. The detail was minor, almost imperceptible, yet to Miss Marple it spoke volumes. She crouched briefly, observing the subtle imprint in the snow nearby. Footprints, partially obscured, led not toward the houses but away, following the curve of the lane into the darkening woods. A faint shiver ran through her, not of fear but of anticipation. The village had survived the drama of the past days, but these small disturbances, easily dismissed by those less observant, suggested that the story was not entirely over. Miss Marple straightened, her mind cataloguing every loose end, the way Mrs. Grafton had orchestrated Margaret's actions, the stolen hymn book, the cryptic letters, the faintly blurred photograph. Ever. Why clue had its explanation, yet some patterns remained too subtle to ignore. As she continued walking toward the vicarage, her thoughts wandered back to Lionel Evercombe. The man who had seemed so untouchable, so clever in his day, had set in motion a chain of events that neither Margaret nor Mrs. Grafton could entirely control. Even as justice had been administered, the consequences of one man's arrogance had rippled far beyond the immediate players. Miss Marple sensed that somewhere, in the quiet corners of the village, or perhaps beyond, another ripple was waiting to surface, imperceptible until the moment it struck. She entered the vicarage hall, the familiar scent of pine and fire greeting her once more. The constable had left to file the final reports, and the house seemed to settle into an uneasy stillness. Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet smile. It was rare that a mystery concluded without leaving a faint shadow behind, a thread of curiosity that could not be entirely severed, and she, of all people, recognized that these lingering threads were often the ones that hinted at the future, at the cases that would demand her observation next. Her gaze fell on the mantel once again. Among the photographs and ornaments, a small slip of paper caught her eye, a note hastily written that she could have easily overlooked in the shuffle of events. Its ink was slightly smudged, and the handwriting faint yet unmistakable. She picked it up and read the few words scrawled there. Not all is as it seems. Watch the corner of the east window at dusk. Miss Marple's brow arched. The note made no sense immediately, yet she recognized the style, deliberate, almost teasing. Someone wanted to draw attention subtly, to leave a clue just visible enough for the right person to notice. She set it aside carefully, knowing that in her experience, such cryptic messages were never idle. Shh! E-fire crackled softly, and outside the window the snow continued to fall, covering the streets in silence. Miss Marple took a deep breath and allowed herself a small, satisfied nod. The primary mystery was resolved, the crimes had been uncovered, the motivations exposed, the guilty confronted. Yet in the subtle imprint of footprints, the flattened wreath, and the cryptic note, the faint echo of a new puzzle remained. A mystery never truly ends, she reflected. It simply waits for the right observer to notice the pattern, to piece together the next intricate design hidden in plain sight. She stepped back from the mantel, her eyes sweeping the room one last time. Outside, the village continued in its fragile, snow-blanketed peace, unaware of the undercurrents that still lingered. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and prepared to leave, walking toward the door with measured steps, knowing that the threads she had followed today might someday lead her to another case, and somewhere, in that quiet falling snow, the future whispered faintly, promising intrigue yet to come.